its science goals, and our approximately 3-year out current anticipated timeline. I'll then turn it over to Paul Bowden from the University of Washington, who is representing the SZ4D Operations Planning Committee. He's going to give you more details about the planned instrumental deployments, their location, types of instrumentation, rough sense of scale, and density of deployments and deployment strategies. And then we're going to open it up to questions from you, and you're welcome to ask questions throughout. You should see a Q&A feature in the Zoom toolbar, and so please go ahead and enter your questions there. And once we finish with these two presentations, we'll basically be working through the questions in that feature. Also, this talk is being recorded and will be available on the SZ4D YouTube channel shortly after this, as soon as our program manager, program director, Anais Burrow, has the opportunity to post it. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I want to do is just clarify the goals and especially the target audience for this particular hour. This is a public event that's open to everyone and anyone, but we really designed this particular hour specifically towards manufacturers, vendors, potential vendors of instruments that might be interested in learning more about SZ4D, its timeline, its instrumentation needs. So this is not, there is no new information if you've attended a recent webinar or are keeping up with SZ4D through various channels. This is not meant for discussion of science, planning, anything. And we certainly, if given that, if you find yourself in that position, we certainly won't be offended if you can find a different, better use for this hour and are going to log off. This is really meant for a very specific audience. So what we're going to do, our goals are to tell you about our science goals and plans and our timeline. A little bit in that, especially in the timeline, about our current funding support and various programs that we are anticipating targeting for various pieces of SZ4D, and a little bit about the internal process specifically towards the targeted infrastructure funding for SZ4D. We want to talk to you a bit about our current status in thinking about the observational, the instrumental arrays for SZ4D, with an important caveat that the planning of these instrumental arrays is still very much active. And so what we're telling you today is the current understanding, and that may very well change as we move forward and continue to refine those plans. So these are not final plans by any means. And then we're mainly looking to address either technical questions about the arrays or the instruments to the extent that we can, or about our process from you in the audience. So let's begin at the beginning. What is SZ4D? Hopefully you've heard of SZ4D. We've been in sort of official planning for almost 8 years now, going back to 2016. SZ4D is subduction zones in 4 dimensions. It's a community-driven initiative for a very long term. And by long term, I want to emphasize that we are talking multi-decadal interdisciplinary research program that has the fundamental goal of understanding the limits and possibilities of predicting geohazards, specifically geohazardous events like large earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, and other catastrophic mass movements, and tsunami. We are not aiming to predict these events or forecast them. We are really aimed at trying to understand the extent from a fundamental science perspective to which various aspects of these events might be predictable. We are using subduction zones as natural laboratories for these efforts. Obviously, all of these phenomena occur in places other than subduction zones, but we've identified subduction zones as the ideal natural laboratories for these efforts, for this problem. And we are working to create very multifaceted infrastructure along with other resources and activities that are really needed to enable to address this question and understand these geohazardous phenomena. And we are a very diverse group, and at this point, large group of scientists from multiple countries. I think we currently have something like 150, and ICE may correct me in the comments, to 160 scientists throughout our governance structure from various countries. A large number of disciplines represented and backgrounds, again, focused primarily on earthquakes, eruptions, and surface processes. I'm going to talk in a few slides about how we sort of break down SZ4D and what we specifically mean by instrumentation or infrastructure and what we mean by activities. But the point here is that these two things together are really our strategy towards these science goals. Okay. So let me elaborate a bit more on this key goal of understanding the limits and possibilities of predicting these events. And really what we're trying to do through the SZ4D initiative is define these limits and possibilities. We have some ability, for example, with volcanic eruptions, to make forecasts, or rather monitoring agencies around the world often do have successes in forecasting eruptions, but particularly in some cases where there's very limited instrumentation, we often have eruptions or changes in a volcanic system that's already in eruption, such as the intensification of the eruption at Hunga that we want to understand. Would that have been predictable to an extent had there been instruments available? Are there aspects of these phenomena that are simply not predictable? Can we forecast not only the likelihood of an eruption or an earthquake or a landslide, but can we also say something about its volume, its magnitude, its extent, how long it will take, whether it will be followed by an increase in similar events or lesser? So these are the types of things that we're really trying to explore. Are these systems physically predictable given good observations of processes before, during, and after? And to do this, our strategy is to capture events in context. So we often study a large earthquake or a volcanic eruption or a tsunami, really kind of thinking about that event in very much in isolation. And so our strategy is really to think about the context. And this is where the 4D of SZ4D comes in. We are interested in looking at the long-term behavior of the system, but also the context of the system in terms of its tectonic setting, in terms of other processes that are occurring nearby. And really what we are trying to do is not just observe one of these events, or ideally many of these events, but also observe and very much use their context in the context of this natural laboratory that a subduction zone provides. And to do so really requires long-term, that's important, but also very systematic instrumentation. And so what we are aiming to do, of course, there are instruments around the world, various networks, but the reason that SZ4D is planning for this very large new deployment is because we want to make very systematic observations. We want to make the same types of observations across large spatial areas and across time, the same diversity of observations from place to place and through time. And this is something that is very much missing in existing catalogs, that we cannot understand the extent to which that limits our ability to understand these systems and forecast or predict their behavior. And of course, we need a very collaborative and interdisciplinary but regional focus. And so all of these processes require perspectives from geochemistry, geology, geophysics, remote sensing. So we're really aiming to bring together a diverse group of scientists to collaborate on these problems from different perspectives and different approaches. So collaborative and interdisciplinary. And then finally, coming back to why we are specifically focused on subduction zones as ideal natural laboratories, is that they allow us, because all of these events happen in subduction zones, some of the most extreme cases of these events on Earth happen in subduction zones, we can really use their interaction, not necessarily their triggering of each other, but their understanding in a given region, whether and to the extent to which they appear to interact, as a set of natural experiments. So how does a volcanic system erupt to a nearby earthquake, or does it not? And that's information. What does that interaction tell us about the system? So this is really something we can do in subduction zones, and why we are focusing on multi-hazard in SZ4D, because we can learn about one of these hazards by studying its interaction or lack of interaction and the nature of that to other nearby transient phenomena. So hopefully this is a document that you're familiar with. This is our implementation plan. It's not a proposal, but this was the first major planning effort of SZ4D, starting with our research coordination network, which wrapped up just about a year ago. It seems like it was a long time ago, but it's really only been a year since we released this plan. This is basically the book of everything that we, the scientific community, has worked to put together, to vet through the community, to gather input, to lay out the key science questions, the notional experiments that are required to address those science questions, and also where we should be performing these notional experiments. So there's a lot of detail in this, and it's a very important document. It's worth looking through. This is kind of our starting. We don't change things from this point. This is kind of our what we have firmly decided so far. It's more than 176 pages. So feel free to please read the whole thing. But we also have an executive summary and various subchapters that may be of more or less interest to individuals in the audience. And I'm just going to go through a few brief elements of the implementation plan in the next few slides. So again, why are we studying geohazards and the limits and possibilities of predicting them in subduction zones? Well, first off, these are the places on Earth where many of the largest geohazardous phenomena like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides occur. So they are very important societally, but also, again, because these give us very good natural laboratories where we can study within a given subduction zone what might be driving variability within that subduction zone, or we may be looking at pairs of subduction zones to try to understand maybe what broader tectonic characteristics or parameters might explain differences or might not be that important in the processes that drive these phenomena. So we have this great opportunity to use both a long strike variability or a long strike consistently and pairs of subduction zones or multiple subduction zones to really try and dig into what controls the nature of the physical processes, the chemical processes that lead to eruptions and earthquakes, and to help us understand the extent to which we might use this understanding to forecast these events or predict these events. Okay, this is a very important figure. It basically encapsulates everything in the what are we going to do about it. And so I mentioned before that we talk about instrumentation, our observational arrays and activities. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what we mean, and this is very specific language within SZ4D. Paul is going to get into a lot more detail on the observational subarrays, mega array, bulk array, and surf array, which collectively are known as multi-array. But this is the instrumental effort. We anticipate that we hope, we plan that it will be a multi-decadal deployment over large segments of subduction zones in multiple subduction zones. And this is really our attempt to record very consistently the information that we believe is critical to study these processes. But that's just data. And so activities are really what we do with that data. So the analysis of the data from the observational arrays, but also as well, other observations like field geology. I mean, this is the only opportunity to go backwards in time, and that's really critical when you're trying to study processes that might be influenced by longer term phenomena, geologic phenomena. So there's a large component of geologic work, geophysical imaging, both onshore and offshore, numerical modeling, laboratory experiments, and training and outreach. And that's what we mean by activities. The other key thing that the implementation implementation plan presents is the locations for SZ4D work, both the observational arrays and the activities. And the report basically recommends that we adopt complementary domestic and international sites. And after a very methodical review of all of the world's subduction zones, we recommended Chile as the international site, and Paul will talk a bit more about where within Chile. Chile is a very big place. So we've gone a little farther than what it says in the implementation report in terms of not just Chile, but where in Chile, or at least where we're going to focus in Chile. But also we're recommending the 2 domestic subduction zones, Cascadia and Alaska. The report also recommends a balance with the majority of the observational arrays actually being sited in Chile, and much less of that being sited in Cascadia and Alaska, but a much more equal balance you can see of activities, especially between Chile and Cascadia. So these are broad numbers, but they should give you kind of a sense of where we anticipate that much of the infrastructure will be located during an SZ4D implementation phase. Okay, so that was a year ago that we put this plan out, a multi-year effort to develop the plan, and I think we gave ourselves a little bit of a break, but we have actually been very busy since we released this report. And so now I want to shift and talk a little bit about our current funding and activities over the past year. We are currently supported by 2 major grants from the National Science Foundation, primarily one that we refer to as the Catalyst Grant or Catalyst Proposal. This is what sort of sustains the planning work of the SZ4D initiative at present. It funds primarily staff, anais, and organization of work towards building equity and capacity. Our communications, we have a very active website and set of communications, including our e-newsletter, which comes out quarterly. Our website is very up to date, so I encourage you all to dig through it regularly. We use it as a major communications tool, and our listserv, and as a registration, as one of the registrants for this meeting, you will be added to our listserv, and we regularly communicate not just upcoming events, but also new issues of our e-newsletter, other possible events of interest to the community, and so on. We held a large community meeting to introduce the implementation plan last November in Houston. We are a community initiative. Those of us who show up and present at these are representatives of the broad community of these fields of geoscience. And so we are very regularly in communication for feedback from the broader scientific community to ensure that we are representing what people believe to be the most important road towards addressing these questions. We regularly have events at major meetings, both in person and virtual. Now that we have selected Chile as our international site, we are producing materials in Spanish and English. We are getting more formal with the launch of our new bylaws, which you can find on our website, our evolving governance structure, which is regularly rotated and repopulated. It's pretty advanced at this point, and we have multiple committees. You can read about that on our website. We have a partnership now with a Chilean consortium. It's a formal consortium of universities known as AndesNet that is basically planning for science and activities on the Chilean side. We very much are working towards this being a partnership with the Chilean science community, them doing science and work on these problems independently and in collaboration with US and other international scientists. So we are very frequently interacting with AndesNet. In fact, I'm in Santiago, Chile this week to continue to interact with both AndesNet and various other agencies in Chile as we continue our planning. We now also have a group called SZ4 Grads, which is our early career arm. And so they have gotten very organized in terms of networking events, webinars, again, international partnerships and collaborations, and so on. A big part of our Catalyst proposal was aimed at beginning to realistically evaluate the costs of the arrays proposed in the implementation plan, as well as other activities and trade-offs of instrumentation options. We, earlier this year, had a meeting with the Chilean science community here just north of Santiago to begin to refine the footprint of the arrays in Chile. Paul is going to show you a bit more about that. We are refining the instrumentation through our various committees, getting feedback from the committees on behalf of their communities. We are beginning to think about data management, evaluating emerging technologies. So we are really in a phase where we are starting to start getting into the nuts and bolts of what this should actually look like in terms of instruments on the ground and what the trade-offs are, and what really is the appropriate scale to make a major impact on the underlying science questions. We are also working to advance other activities on a larger scale. The geological community, we have a new initiative called GeoArray that is aimed at sort of developing models for sort of large coordinated geological field efforts. We have a modeling consortium that is actively putting in proposals to support their efforts. We have a laboratory group that is also organizing both workshops and proposals. So we're basically moving on 6 parallel fronts. And so this is our Catalyst proposal, our Catalyst funding, but we also have had other funding sources. We have another major grant from NSF, which is called SCNet. This is an ExcelNet proposal. It's about $2 million, and that's really aimed at supporting a lot of the international work. And I'll show you a slide and summarize briefly what we're doing through SCNet. That's something that's still spinning up right now. We have funding for some pilot efforts in geological field work in collaboration with Strabo. And then we have internal funding from UC Santa Cruz, which is the home institution of Emily Brodsky, the chair of SZ4D. So we are actively obtaining and pursuing various lines of funding to move all of the pieces of SZ4D forward. I mentioned, I'll just go through this briefly. I think the only other thing I want to say on this about the Catalyst proposal is that we very much front-loaded the activities in our Catalyst proposal. And you can kind of see that in this diagram off to the right, that now at the very tail end of 2023, most of what we're sort of wrapping up the technical project management at this point. We've done a lot of the work in terms of workshops and coordination, and we are largely now wrapping up the technical project management and primarily funding staff with the Catalyst proposal. And then SCNet is just starting to launch. It's one of the activities that Emily and I have been working on here in Chile. This is again, an international piece with part of it, most of the in-person activities focused on the US-Chile relationship, but also other international partners who have active collaborations in Chile. And then we have a larger, broader consortium in SCNet that is basically all of the world's subduction zones. And so we'll be having regular coordination meetings, science meetings, and we will be specifically between the US and Chile starting to launch field schools and student exchanges over the coming years. And so this is SCNet is really aimed at supporting these both broader but more focused in-person international conversations and activities. Okay, so the last thing I want to touch on is our timeline, which I think is probably the part that many people are most interested in. I want to start by this with this figure, which is from the National Science Foundation's Research Infrastructure Guide, basically laying out the sort of generic or expected timeline for projects of an MREFC scale, the boundary between MSRI and MREFC being $100 million. As I'll mention, we're sort of on the cusp of that as far as we know, right on that boundary. And the key point here is that we view ourselves as being at the end of a development phase. I mentioned that we've been formally working on SZ4D planning since about 2016. We think we're about at the stage of transition to a design phase. That design phase is not yet funded, and we anticipate that it may need to be relatively short. But it is critical to really assess the scalability through some modeling work to understand what the scale of various deployments need to be to adequately address the science questions. So this is where we are in kind of this broader picture, maybe relative to other projects of the scale that we anticipate. So it is a very important time in a transition year, and we currently, our thinking is that this phase of design may be relatively quick and hopefully onto construction on the faster end of things. Okay, and then the final slide I have is our sort of 3-year anticipated timeline. And basically the yellow here is what's been funded. So we kind of view ourselves as having 4 parallel efforts. The first arrow up here is our infrastructure effort. Our current plan is to target the mid-scale research infrastructure 2 program, potentially in mid-2025, depending on whether we fit, whether we can address the science goals through a program of the scale that fits within an MSRI, and you can see here that we also have off ramps to the MREFC if it turns out that is the more appropriate route, and also an MSRI design phase if we find that we need more extensive designs. So what I will say is that the absolute earliest humanly possible procurement might be in 2026 at this stage. And again, this is the most optimistic and fastest road ahead for SZ4D. The next track is our science arm. This is our center. It's sort of what the Catalyst proposal has been working towards, as well as the MSRI track, and we are anticipating putting in a proposal for the NSF Geohazard Center call, hopefully early next year, to begin funding science activities through a formal center. Again, we have an off-ramp here to the STC program at NSF, if that is deemed more appropriate. SCNet I've already talked about, that is already funded, and we are actively spinning that up. And then we kind of have this associated activities, various other proposals. We just this week, our modeling community put in several proposals to NSF for community scale modeling efforts. We have MRI proposals going in to support some of the laboratory work. As I mentioned, we have a funded proposal for pilot work in field geology. So this hopefully gives you kind of a sense of in one picture of both the scale of this, the various elements, and kind of our optimistic timeline for how SZ4D will evolve on various fronts over the coming years. Okay, so with that, I think I will stop my share and I will turn it over to you, Paul, to talk a little more detail about the instrumental arrays.
All right, I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Oh, I need to share my screen. Hang on just 1 second here. All right, and now can you see my screen?
You are good to go, Paul.
Thank you so much. Okay, so just briefly reiterate what Diana said, that the SZ4D project is trying to get at the basic science to understand these kinds of cascading and interrelated hazards, and subduction zones, great place to do that. You know, basically the notion is we're going to look, be seeing how big earthquakes or eruptions, how they interact, and what their impacts are. Yeah. And this slide summarizes what I hope you'll take away from this, just the major takeaways. First of all, the work to date and a lot of what we've been thinking about has been the Chilean margin. So working in Chile, although there will be elements in Cascadia and Alaska, about 70% of the effort is going to take place in Chile, and that's been a major focus. Within the Chilean margin, and I'll show this later on, but generalized locales for doing array observations have been identified. And we call that blobs on a map. So I'll show you the blobs on a map, but I won't show you the dots on the map because we don't have them. They're not, those are the detailed individual sites. You won't see that, but you'll see where the arrays will go in general. Also, even the types of instrumentation and the numbers and the density of them are still evolving, you know, and no doubt they will evolve more. But the SZ4D leadership has notions, and the implementation plan is a great place if you haven't familiarize yourself with that. It is important to realize the scale is not tens of instruments and it's not thousands of instruments, but it's somewhere between 10 squared and 10 cubed instruments. Let's call it, you know, 10 to the E, something like that. That said, SZ4D so far is the focus within our discussions has been on proven technologies that we think will work. That is to say, this isn't an instrument development project. So we're not going to be necessarily building new kinds of instruments for this. At least, I mean, I imagine we're open to it, but that's not a priority. And just to wrap things up, to know that the process is leading to this MSRI-2 instrumentation program that will be in effect for multiple decades. So it's a multi-decadal program. And the funding for those is currently up to about $100 million. All right, so let me tell you about the arrays, the three arrays that Diana mentioned, and some, they're partially overlapping arrays, and they have subarray components. And this is what the scientific community has deigned would be the best places to learn what we need, or what we think we need to learn to meet our objectives. And there, you'll also hear some discussion of this term multi-array, which is either the overlapping nature of these three arrays, or maybe there's some total. I'm not sure what the best definition is. Okay, so the three arrays, the first one is the mega array. It's not because it's big, although it's big, but it's because it focuses mostly on the megathrust fault and faulting in general. It is in itself amphibious in the sense there's an offshore part and an onshore part. And the second, and the target of the mega array are faulting related processes. The Volk array has to do with volcanoes. It's the active magmatic processes, and there's subarrays for doing imaging and of volcanoes, and subarrays for monitoring a number of volcanoes. And responding if there's active magmatic processes. Then there's surf array, which has nothing to do with the Beach Boys, although I think about it all the time when I hear it. It's not about surfing, but it's about surface geological observations and kind of geologic hazards. And on this slide, I say it's perhaps the most poorly defined. I think that's probably not fair way to say it. It's the one I'm least familiar with, so it's the most unfamiliar, and maybe to this group too. Mega array. Okay, this is the blobs on a map, and it's not just mega array. This is all shows you the locations of the three arrays as blobs on a map. The focus is the central Chilean margin. And as you see on the left, in the middle are the blobs. So these are the geographical footprints of the three different kinds of arrays I'm talking about: mega, volc, and surf. And I guess it's important to say that these blobs were worked out after much consultation, collaborative studies, meetings. As I think Diana mentioned, this is where the scientists think this is the best place for us to get our questions answered about the Chilean margin. And so this over here on the right, where it talks about less mentioned and more mentioned, that refers to discussions amongst the scientists. So the darker color shades are ones that are more secure, more sure of, more frequently cited as being important. So the pink parts are the mega array, and that's the brownish colors are the volcano array. That depends on where the active volcanism is and so forth. And the surface array, surf array are in green. And this kind of orange blob, I think of as being, it's the overlap of these, and I think of that might be the multi-array. You can also talk about these instrumentation, think of it as being divided into offshore and onshore components. That's what I've done in this slide. The right-hand figure here shows from the implementation plan a notional idea of what this was on of what these instrumentation might look like in the mega array. And specifically offshore, it would consist of conventional, what I call conventional OBSs that measure, have seismometers, they have pressure sensors for doing geodetic kind of measurements, temperature, and so forth. These are, but they're autonomous. They're not cabled. There may be a bathymetric mapping component to this, but that's still being discussed. But it's of great interest what the surface of these fault blocks are. Currently, there's no plans to cable any of these. It's thought to be too expensive, although it's being discussed that perhaps 5 years down the road, we would find an area that's we want to densify, and that's indicated over on this slide by the little red dots. And we could densify for particular purposes there. The big consideration for offshore instrumentation is, of course, the cost of deployment and maintenance. So all those offshore elements, you need to think about power, servicing, what happens if they break, and so forth. It's a complicated thing, but that's what we're working through. The onshore component is to augment regional stations with magnetotellurics and 6-channel seismic stations. So that's a densification of the Chilean seismic network, which is, of course, already there. This is what it looks like offshore for the 10-year. It's actually multiple decades, so more than 10 years. But those would be OBSs with pressure gauges on them, and also acoustic GNSS for a much fewer number for doing geodesy. And then offshore, there'd also be some magnetotelluric component that's not permanently deployed, but would go out for periods of time. Onshore, broadband and strong motion seismic stations, a number of mini arrays, so small clusters for doing array analysis and geodetic monitoring. Bulk array, there are two subarray types of bulk array. One's called the sensor subarrays, and that's what's shown on the left here. And there would be a number of volcanoes with permanent or 10-year, multiple 10-year clusters of instruments around them, about on the order of 6, you imagine, per volcano. And they would include, and the purpose for them is to study the magmatic system through an eruption cycle. So they're there and monitor these volcanoes, and they include. I'll show you some of the instrumentation in the next slide, I think, but a variety of usual volcano-looking stuff. Then the second kind of subarray is the volcano imaging subarray. So that's to actually look at the plumbing of the volcanoes to figure, and the vision for this is you have 3 pairs, say, of pairs of adjacent volcanoes that and then you image the plumbing beneath those and the crustal structure. That's not just plumbing beneath those volcanoes. And so these would include seismics, so permanent installations as well as transportable kind of installations. And that's to get a good picture of the architecture of these pairs of volcanoes. I'm kind of less familiar with a lot of this, so here's pictures of what this kind of stuff would look like. Ash collection, you know, it would be a little, you could have seismics hooked up, cameras, scanners, gas sensors, that sort of instrumentation. So for the permanent kind of 10-year thing with clusters of about 6 per volcano, this is the list that we currently have: ash collectors, seismometers, infrasound, tilt meter, geodesy, GNSS, cameras, thermal sensors of various sorts, and gas sensors of various sorts. Those are the sensor arrays, 30 to 50 volcanoes, six of them per volcano. Imaging arrays, of imaging arrays, we'd have nodal seismics, so seismics that transportable, broadband seismics, MT, gravimetry, and active seismic source for studying structure. All right, Volc array. And surf array, so this is all about surface geologic hazards. And it's mostly geological, although there are some geophysical observables in this. But the idea here is to pick, and as far as I know, these haven't been finally selected or looked in, you know, at that level, but these would be to pick a couple of watersheds, individual watersheds, and understand the superficial processes, do the basic science to understand the superficial processes that are related to the geohazards of in the subduction zone. So and a lot of this are stream discharge, sediment concentration, bed load transport, soil moisture, which story about that, but I'm not so familiar with these, so I don't know what kind of instrumentation would necessarily be associated with surf array. So I beg off answering detailed questions about that. Maybe Diana can. And I'll just conclude here by re-showing this timeline that these 3 arrays with all their subarrays, what we're working on now will be to develop a proposal to fund and build those arrays. And we're looking at probably the end of next year, 2024, to begin a real creating the proposal that will be due sometime in mid-2025, and the earliest possible array procurement being in 2026. As Diana said, the earliest human possible. That's the timeline to procurement, and with deployment in 2027. But in the meantime, there's lots of activities to keep us all busy. But that's what we're looking at in terms of time. And I'm going to stop my share. And
great. And I'm going to actually just throw one final slide up here. So I mentioned that all of you will be registered for our regular communications. Before we move into questions, I do just want to address explicitly one question that we do get periodically, which is, can we have a meeting with you and show you what we're working on? And so I just want to state upfront that we're very concerned and careful about ensuring the integrity of an anticipated procurement process. So we have not, and we cannot take individual meetings with potential vendors. We are certainly welcome to, you're welcome to contact us, give us feedback, ask questions, come attend our community events. So we may have similar events like this when we feel that it's an appropriate time for an update. But basically the best way to keep, and we hope that you continue to keep an eye on us as our planning evolves, is really to watch our listserv, look at our website, engage with us through future community events. And please understand that we can't have meetings with potential vendors one-on-one. So at this point, I think we have about 10 minutes left for any Q&A. I don't see any open questions in the Q&A box, but you're welcome to ask questions and we'll do our best to address them.
Well, we were so thorough.
I see a raised hand. Nice, can we do that?
I'll ask the dumb question. Will the
Okay.
presentation slides be made available?
I believe our current plan is to post this video on YouTube. Do we let us think about that? I think we can
Okay.
most of what we've shown is available on our website, and I think we just want to have a quick pass through. But I think
that's fine, just for sharing with colleagues.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Any other question, please raise your hand. Oh, we have a question in the Q&A. Will all instruments be made through a centralized entity?
That is something that we are still actively working on. So I don't think I can give you an answer at this point. There are a few different models for this. It in part depends on which funding track we ultimately pursue. So I don't think there's an answer I can give you right now. But that would be optimal. Question for Paul about long-term OBS. You said no cables, but how will you get the data back on land? Waveglider ? And as no cable. So just to re-emphasize what Paul said, we are actively looking into cables, but for a sort of second phase offshore. So Paul, maybe can you comment on phase one and how that's how we anticipate that working in terms of data return?
Yeah, no, well, I can say, as far as I know in the discussions in the OPC, no decision has been made about whether we would use some of the new Waveglider technology to get data back, or just traditionally going out every either year or possibly, depending on what kind of instrumentation went out, 18 months or even 2 years. The situation is developing with those kind of instrument packages, as I understand it. And it would just, I think we would at least do the kind of annual, or maybe a little bit longer than annual, recovery of the data the old-fashioned way. We are very excited about newfangled ways of of getting data using wave gliders and so forth, and that is certainly up for discussion. I hope that answers your question with a kind of a non-answer. It's not decided yet, but it's being actively discussed.
Will existing OBS instrumentation pools be leveraged for the offshore component? Will we create a new pool? I think I can say pretty straightforward that given the scale of SZ4D and the scale of current OBS pools, we anticipate creation of a new pool that is dedicated to SZ4D. Paul, if you want to add anything to that, go ahead.
I
think that's a pretty clear one.
Yeah, I think we have to. Yeah, we will need more OBSs.
Okay. Another one for you, Paul. I'm not sure if you're reading these or you want me to read them.
No, that's a very good question, and I believe the answer is some of them, but not all of them. A lot of it is dependent on particular geographic locations. So when we get from the blobs on a map phase to the dots on a map phase, we would certainly have better answers of how telemetry would be done. But it's for at least most of the uses that we've been talking about, having very rapid kind of earthquake early warning style telemetry is not necessarily going to be critical. And then for the imaging arrays, specifically around volcanoes, those are not required. It's not required to have any telemetry for those. They'll be because their purpose is not to see changes while they're in place. So it's a mixed bag, Horst, about as to what I will say is there's a huge feeling amongst the OPC folks, at any rate, that having telemetered stations near real time, at any rate, really does lead to better performance of the network, because you know when things are working or if quality is degrading and stuff.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there isn't necessarily so the key word in the question there is live. I think, given that this is a fundamental research effort, near real time is not critical for that. Those Paul notes, getting the data as early as possible is important to the integrity of those data and the integrity of the network. That said, there may be other entities that we are partnering with that may have an interest in those data in near real time, and that is an open and ongoing discussion. Will all instrumentation procurements be made through US entities? I think that is very likely to be the case. We are obviously in working with the Chileans. I mentioned that we consider this a partnership. There is an independent partner organization in Chile. I cannot speak for them to the extent that they might procure instrumentation. Obviously, that would be a different case. But I think as far as SZ4D goes, it is a US. It will be based through a US entity. Okay, and we maybe have time for one more question before we wrap up. Okay. Well, hopefully this was helpful and not a little too frustrating. We're trying to balance giving information and really what we feel that we're at a point where we can say something specific. Again, please continue to engage with us. We want this conversation to be ongoing between you and SC4D. Thank you very much for your time, and have a great weekend, everyone.
And thank you, Anais, for
yes, and behind the curtain.
Yeah. Bye then.